There are imposters among us. Not the kind that got us all through 2020, but the real kind. During World War II, both sides created several specialized units whose men were sent behind enemy lines in disguise. They were trained in the art of walking, talking, and fighting like their enemy in order to blend in. These spies then left the safety of their camps behind to sow chaos and destruction on the other side. Some with more success than others. Today, we're going to be talking about 3 of these units, what they did, and whether or not they were sus enough to get caught. Like something out of a Tarantino film, the men who made up the Special Interrogation Group, or SIG, were German-speaking Jews who disguised themselves as German soldiers and infiltrated their ranks. This unit was the brainchild of Captain Herbert Cecil Buck. Before World War II, he was an Oxford scholar and German linguist. After the war broke out, he joined the British Army, first serving with the 1st Punjab Regiment and then later with the Scots Guard. While stationed in North Africa in late 1941, he was captured by the German Afrika Korps. He was only imprisoned for a short time before he managed to escape. Somehow, he managed to get his hands on a few pieces of German uniform, which he used, along with his fluent German, to walk right out of the POW camp and back to the British side. The whole ordeal sparked the idea in Buck's mind that if he could sneak out of the German ranks, other British soldiers like him could sneak in. Used offensively, they could have the opportunity to gather intelligence or sabotage German operations in North Africa. Buck took the idea to his superiors, the Middle Eastern heads of the Special Operations Executive. They didn't hesitate to approve it, and in March 1942, the plan was set in motion. Back at the War Office in London, Colonel Terence Avery wrote that a special German group as a subunit of Middle East Commando with the cover name Special Interrogation Group to be used for infiltration behind the German lines in the Western Desert under 8th Army. The strength of the special group would be approximately that of a platoon. The personnel are fluent German linguists, mainly Palestinian Jews of German origin. Many of them have had war experience with No. 51 Commando. The British Army asked for volunteers that could speak German to join the SIG. While it's not clear how many volunteered, the final number of imposters landed somewhere between 20 and 38, depending on the source. The majority of the men were German Jews who had fled Germany to escape the genocide and ended up in Palestine. They joined the British Army soon after the war broke out to fight those who were persecuting their people. There was a lot of risk for these men. If they were found out, they wouldn't be taken prisoner, but tortured, not only for fighting with the Allies but also for being Jewish. For that reason, Buck made sure that much of their training was about knowing how to act like a German soldier. They were trained by 2 Afrika Korps POWs who claimed to be against the Nazi regime. This made the men of the SIG deeply uncomfortable and apprehensive, but Buck didn't care and had the training continue. The men learned German army songs and slang, they wore German uniforms, and they were even given fake German identities, complete with pictures of fake girlfriends. By June 1942, they were ready for their first big mission. They were sent to Tunisia and split into 2 teams. One would attack the Martuba airfield, and the other would attack the Derna airfield. The Martub team, clad in their German disguises, drove through the German roadblocks without any problem under the guise of transporting some French prisoners. They were so convincing that some of the German soldiers told the SIG members to be careful because the British had been seen operating in the area recently. When they got to the airfield, they got to work and managed to destroy 20 aircraft without getting caught before slipping away into the night. The Derna team wasn't so lucky. They traveled with one of their German teachers who drove the truck. Suddenly, he claimed there was something wrong with the truck and that he needed to go ask for help at a nearby German camp, leaving the SIG soldiers behind. When he returned, he brought with him a handful of German soldiers. 2 of the SIG soldiers, still untrusting of their teacher and possibly fearful of being tortured, jumped out of the truck and immediately opened fire, which resulted in both of their deaths. It's unclear exactly how, but one of the SIG soldiers in the truck survived and made it to the rendezvous point even though he was injured. 3 months later, in September 1942, the SIG initiative came to an end after they assisted in an attack on the port of Tobruk, which the British planned to attack from both land and sea. Everything went well at first, but then the British figured out that the fort was more well defended than they had originally thought. The double-fisted attack had little effect, and by the time the British requested backup, some 750 of their men had already been killed, captured, gone missing, or been wounded. Even Captain Buck was captured during the attack, and this time he wasn't able to escape after a few weeks. Instead, he spent the next 3 years in a German POW camp. Thankfully, most members of the SIG survived the attack, and many went on to survive the war. But the failure at Tobruk was a hefty loss, and with the leader of the SIG rotting in a German prison camp, the British Army no longer had the will to keep SIG going, so the soldiers were reassigned to different units. Following the Allied success on D-Day in 1944, Hitler grew nervous as his enemies gained a larger foothold in Europe. He was planning the Ardennes offensive, which later became known as the Battle of the Bulge. The ultimate goal was to launch a massive attack on the Allies and retake Antwerp, which was home to a vital resupply port for the Allies. This was Hitler's last stand, and he was desperate for a major win, so there were no half measures. As part of his counter-offensive, he came up with a devious plan. He wanted to send English-speaking German soldiers behind enemy lines to create chaos and to capture the bridges on the River Meuse, as they had become important to Allied supply lines. Hitler named this plan Operation Greif. To make Operation Greif happen, he called on Otto Skorzeny, a scary-looking lieutenant colonel who had recently returned to Germany after successfully leading Operation Panzerfaust, which had seen the removal of the Hungarian regent from power by kidnapping his son in order to keep Hungary loyal to Germany. Hitler trusted Skorzeny to lead Operation Greif and met with him in October 1944 to lay out the plan. Despite the immense risks, Skorzeny had no qualms about taking the operation. The plan was kept incredibly secret. Many involved in Operation Greif didn't know what they were supposed to do until the day it launched. Those that did know were very skeptical that the operation would succeed, with one officer stating the entire offensive had not more than a 10% chance of success. Still, the skepticism didn't stop the Führer's plan from moving forward. A request was put out for 3,300 soldiers with knowledge of the English language and also the American dialect. Soon after, German soldiers who fit the criteria began receiving cryptic orders telling them they were needed for interpreter duties and to report to a special training camp. Upon arrival at the camp, each man was questioned in English by an SS officer. The Germans managed to scrape together 2,500 men to form Panzer Brigade 150, and all of them were ordered to sign a pledge of secrecy which stated that breach of the order is punishable by death. Of the 2,500 men, only 150 of the best English speakers were selected to put on American disguises and infiltrate the ranks. The problem was, most of the men had no experience in sabotage or undercover missions. With less than 2 months to prepare for the offensive, they began intense training, learning radio skills, demolition, and close quarter combat. They also learned as much about American soldiers as possible. They learned about their ranks, their drills, their weapons, everything. On top of that, the men had to spend at least 2 hours a day practicing their language skills. Speaking English wasn't good enough. They had to imitate the American accent as best they could and learn the slang. To do this, they watched American films and spent time with American POWs. They also had to learn cultural customs, like tapping cigarettes in a specific way and putting down the knife before eating with a fork. Not doing these things could potentially give them away as German. The men all but lived as Americans amongst Germans. They ate American rations, saluted their superiors like Americans, and were given all their orders in English. But though they lived as Americans and even began feeling American in some ways, Skorzeny wasn't pleased with their progress, saying that the men could certainly never dupe an American, not even a deaf one. But still, the plan moved forward, and Operation Greif would have to do. The soldiers were dressed in American uniforms, carried American weapons, and drove American jeeps. Now looking the part of American soldiers, the Panzer Brigade 150 was finally made aware of what they would be doing behind enemy lines. Their mission was broken down into 3 parts. They had to form small demolition squads of 5 or 6 men to blow up fuel stores, ammunition dumps, and bridges. Form reconnaissance teams of 3 or 4 men to try run information back to the Germans and pass along false orders to American troops to sow chaos. Disrupt the American chain of command by destroying radio stations and field telephone wires. By creating chaos from within, the Germans hoped to weaken the Americans enough to make it impossible to fight back in the Battle of the Bulge. The battle started on December 16th, 1944, and on the second day, a jeep carrying 4 men in American uniforms was stopped by American military police. Though they looked American and spoke English with passable accents, they weren't able to give the policemen the password they asked for. This roused suspicion in the police, who then began to search the jeep, where they ultimately found German weapons, explosives, and swastika emblems. The imposters were immediately arrested and interrogated, which is how the Americans later learned that the objective of that small group was to capture none other than future President Dwight D. Eisenhower, along with other high-ranking officers. This incident sparked immediate paranoia among the Americans. Even though those 4 German imposters had been caught, it stood to reason that the others hadn't been. There were likely already German spies among them, and they were right. There were already several small groups from Operation Greif among the American forces wreaking havoc. Reportedly, one group somehow persuaded an entire US Army unit to withdraw from Puteaux, Belgium. Another got to work swapping around road signs to send a whole regiment in the complete wrong direction. The Americans could see they were being tricked from within and began coming up with ways to smoke out the infiltrators. They set up roadblocks and asked drivers and passengers questions they felt only Americans would know, like sports trivia and state capitals. While this method did work on a number of occasions, it did also lead to several instances of Americans being mistaken for Germans. US Brigadier General Bruce Clark was held at gunpoint after he said incorrectly that the Chicago Cubs were part of the American League. In fact, it wasn't uncommon at all for American soldiers to answer these trivia questions incorrectly, which led to the deaths of 2 servicemen who were shot by a nervous member of the military police. This method also failed to account for British allies, who were also often held at gunpoint for failing to answer questions about baseball and the name of the president's dog. If this had been the chaos the Germans had hoped to sow, then mission accomplished. However, they were never able to complete any of their main objectives, like destroying bridges and communication lines. In total, 44 Germans were sent into American territory and only 8 made it back alive. Based on the Hague Convention of 1907, the Americans were allowed to execute the imposters if they were wearing American uniforms, because, under those circumstances, they automatically forfeited their rights as POWs. As a result, American soldiers were ordered not to let any accused German undress so they could carry out the executions. In the end, all that effort was for nothing, as neither Operation Greif nor the Battle of the Bulge ended in victory for the Germans. Operation Zeppelin was an effort by the Germans to get Soviet POWs to carry out sabotage and espionage operations on the Soviets. And it went about as well as you'd think. The idea of the operation was born at the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. The Germans had small units of interrogators who went to numerous POW camps to work with Soviet soldiers captured during the invasion. The interrogators found that some of the prisoners were willing to cooperate with the Germans. There were many in the Red Army who were not ethnically Russian or who had been negatively affected by Soviet repression and had very little loyalty to the country they served. The Germans were excited at the prospect of using these men to gather intelligence on the Soviets, and they began forming a solid plan to make it work. And by the summer of 1942, they were ready to put Operation Zeppelin into motion. They began asking for volunteers in all of their Soviet prisoner of war camps, and there was no shortage of men who offered themselves up, as they saw it as their best chance of making it out of the camps alive. The problem for the Germans was that the vast majority of the volunteers did not meet the criteria. They were looking for educated anti-communists. The issue was that, because of the Soviet repressions, most of the anti-communists were uneducated and illiterate. Still, they were able to assemble 10 to 15,000 recruits for special training. Those lucky enough to make the cut were sent to training camps where they learned about subversion, sabotage, and radio transmission. Many of the selected prisoners were from the Caucasus and Central Asia. To keep them motivated and loyal, the Germans exploited their anti-communist sentiments by hinting at independence for their people if they succeeded. The camps where they trained were far nicer than their prisons, and the conditions were almost as good as those given to German soldiers. And as the Soviet prisoners were living like German soldiers and training to do work for the German army, they were also provided with German uniforms to wear. But don't let the better living conditions and new uniforms fool you. The Germans still saw these people as beneath them, even though they needed their help in the war. Any recruits who were deemed unfit to carry out missions for Operation Zeppelin were promptly sent to death camps. And some who returned after completing missions were also sent to the death camps. Training for the operation lasted anywhere from 2 weeks to 3 months in the first years of the operation, when there was little structure and more of a focus on quantity over quality. This turned out to be a massive error, however. The Germans had an aircraft shortage, and because of that, many of the missions for Operation Zeppelin had big delays, during which the recruits became idle and filled their spare time with drinking, getting STDs, and rethinking their allegiance. That meant that when a lot of these men were eventually deployed on their missions, they defected and immediately surrendered to the Soviets. In total, the Germans sent some 2,000 to 3,000 recruits on missions across the Soviet Union, and not all of them were failures or ended in defection. They had some small successes in gathering intelligence. One team was able to send reports on the movement of the Red Army after it infiltrated the Soviet People's Commissariat of Transport. Another team sent reports on train movements between Samara and Vladivostok. In their most successful mission, a group of Georgian separatists were able to gather intelligence on the USSR from the Turkish army in exchange for weapons. The mission that Operation Zeppelin is most famous for, however, is the plot to assassinate Stalin. In May 1942, a Russian officer defected to the German side. His original name is hard to pin down, but he took the name Tavrin after joining the Germans. He came to them with tales of his connections to the Soviet High Command and numerous Soviet medals. How much of it was true is unclear. True or not, the Germans began training him for the mission of assassinating Stalin. The plan was for him and his wife to be dropped off at an airfield just outside Moscow, and for them to travel the rest of the way to Moscow on their own. Unfortunately for them, Soviet counterintelligence caught wind of the plan, and the transport plane carrying Tavrin and his wife was hit by Soviet anti-aircraft fire after taking off from Riga, forcing it to land. Tavrin and his wife took off on a motorbike to try and make it to Moscow, but they were soon caught. They, along with everyone on the plane, were captured and executed by the Soviets. By 1944, after many failures, the Germans knew they needed to start focusing on better quality training if they wanted to see any success. They began attaching German agents to the Zeppelin units and quickly found that the German presence made it even more difficult to find reliable Soviet recruits for the operation. And as the end of the war drew nearer, Operation Zeppelin started to fizzle out. In the end, nothing really came of the operation. In a post-war trial, the German chief of foreign intelligence, Walter Schellenberg, was sentenced to 6 years in prison for his role in the executions of Soviet recruits. While it's not clear how many the Germans killed, the estimates are in the thousands. What do you think? Do you have any interesting stories of other impersonation units that were active during World War II? Should Walter Schellenberg have gotten more time in prison? And do you think Operation Zeppelin was doomed to fail from the start? Let us know all that and more in the comments section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.